Welcome to Pete's Property Podcast, brought to you by Buyers and hosted by Pete Wargent, buyer's agent, finance and real estate expert, and all-round property guru, plus published author. Join Pete for 30 minutes as he chats all things property with a new guest each week. Learn practical tips from the movers and shakers in the property industry and well-known personalities sharing their property journeys.
G'day, welcome to this week's Property Pod. I'm excited today to have an extra special guest, Cameron Kusher from REA Group. Cam, welcome. It's great to have you on.
Thanks for having me, Pete.
You're known these days as an exec in economic research at REA Group, very prestigious role. I think you were a dozen years or so at CoreLogic, and then even before that, at PRD and a couple of other research roles. So you're quite a trailblazer in the industry or sector, because as far as memory serves, even only a dozen years ago, there were maybe only sort of half a dozen big names in property market research and reporting, far less than today. And now, of course, you've got an access to a wealth of information and data at REA Group. So I'm sure our listeners will be very eager to hear your thoughts about what the property market's going to do next year. Before we get on to that, first up, it'd be great to hear a little bit about your background and how you got into the sector in the first place. Now, from memory, I think you told me once you used to do music lessons at Cooperoo Mort. So I think I must be right in saying you did your state high schooling in Brisbane and then your higher ed at QUT. But what was your childhood like and where did you grow up?
I was actually born in Sydney. Still go for the Blues in the state of origin, which is, as someone living in Queensland, has been quite depressing over the last 12 to 15. But when my parents were when I was 2 years old, my parents moved to Brisbane. My dad took a job with a transport company up here. For a while, we lived at Greenslopes with my aunt and her husband at the time, but we moved to Bulimba. Bulimba would know that it's an inner city suburb. In 1984, when my parents moved to Bulimba, it was the absolute arse end of the world. I remember my grandmother cried when she was told by my mother that she bought a house in Bulimba because people used to get stabbed down at the pub. It was very rough, a lot of wharfies, a lot of people working at the races across the river. Lived in a three-bedroom house. I had an older brother, older sister. Underwent a massive gentrification between the time that I moved in and where we are now. I've actually ended up moving back to Bulimba now. So I was living elsewhere and I swore that I wasn't going to move back to Bulimba, not because there was anything wrong with it, but I just didn't feel like it was where I was going to end up. But we've gone full circle and I'm back here now. So, yeah, it's really good. I had a really good childhood. I probably didn't do as well at high school or uni as I should have. Wasn't really into study, and the way schools taught wasn't really conducive with me. My parents worked very hard and they taught me the value of hard work, and I think that's how I ended up getting to where I am now.
So I've had this long-running thesis about Australian demographics that on a long enough time horizon, everybody moves to southeast Queensland. So your family's almost a living embodiment of that theory. And it's one of the interesting things that we do see in the capital cities, that gentrification play in some of those landlocked areas. And we often down Oxford Street in the evening, it's a wonderful spot these days, all the restaurants and pubs and pretty much everything you need. The only downside, of course, these days is the traffic. Trying to get in and out of the Bulimba pocket can take a bit of time, but of course you've got the ferry as well. So did you go straight into property market research or did you do any sort of crappy jobs in the meantime?
I worked at a pub in a bottle shop during my university years. But when I did my degree, I actually did a degree in property economics. I thought I wanted to be a property developer. The property economics degree itself is very much targeted at valuation, but I thought, no, that's a good way to become a property developer. And my first job was with a property developer. Unfortunately, it wasn't a very good property developer, and about 18 months into that job, it was pretty clear that they were starting to go under, got given a redundancy. And, when you're a 22-year-old man and you get given, I think I was handed in my redundancy about $9,000 or $10,000 at that. I thought that was great. I think I drank most of it and partied most of it away. But from there, obviously, once I was made redundant, I realised that I needed to actually find a job. Surprisingly enough, I was not great at mathematics or that, but I was always intrigued by statistics. So when I was a kid, I used to remember all the numbers from the back of footy cards, how many tries such and such person scored, and seemed to just have a good knack for remembering numbers and being able to recall them. So I was looking for jobs at the time, looking for any job, and I got this job at PRD Nationwide as their Brisbane research manager. So I was basically undertaking research into the Brisbane apartment market and the Brisbane commercial property market. I started there and enjoyed it and have been doing it ever since, save for about 18 months when I left and worked for a development consultancy, which was also fun, but the consultancy hours are probably not my favourite. Being on call all the time to just jump up and do things as they're needed. I prefer to have a bit more structure. So been in property research since then and still am to this day.
So what do you think is the best thing about doing that type of a role? Do you get an excitement when you get a special insight that nobody else has had? And a secondary question, you seem like you're a natural at the job, but were you always good at it, or did you just learn those skills as you went along?
I would say I probably wasn't always good at it. I definitely learned those skills as I went along. I'm still learning. I still get a lot of feedback on things like my writing and stuff like that. So I don't think you ever stop learning and you can never stop getting better. In terms of the best thing, I think it is that, just finding that unique insight, finding a trend that's predictive of something else that's happening in the market. I think also in my current role at REA Group, we just have this huge amount of data from what consumers are doing on our website. So, finding that piece of data that fills in a blank in the story as to what's happening in the housing market or what could potentially happen in the future. So that to me is the exciting thing. I enjoy reading. So obviously just staying up to date with everything that's happening both in the property market, but also in the economy, and how that's going to translate into the property market is what I find really satisfying about the role. I love presenting. I love getting out there and not necessarily just being in front of an audience, but I love going and talking to customers and getting the feedback from them about what's happening on the ground, whether that be a real estate agency, a property developer, or even going and talking to the risk team in a bank and getting feedback from them as to what's some of the pain points, what they're seeing in the market. I like learning from other people that have got different perspectives.
Yeah, and I've seen you present and seen you many, many times on Sky News and all the TV channels, and you obviously always have excellent insights that other people don't have, especially now with access to all of that data at REA. I'm interested to know, often I've mentioned on podcasts and so on, my wife's a year or two older than me, and she bought her first place, I think, 1996 or something like that. And back in those days, there was no sort of property pull out in the newspaper. There was no real books on real estate investing except a couple from United States. And there was a few things like the Witch Guide to buying property and stuff, but it was really basic. So what I'm really interested to know, these days, of course, we've got almost too much information. Now, has all that extra data helped people to make better decisions, or do they get some kind of analysis paralysis? One of the things I've noticed is that the average tenure of ownership is now about 10 years, and it's actually more, I think, for houses. I might be right in saying. Now, is that just due to the stamp duty costs of buying and selling, or are people actually making better purchase decisions as a result of all the information that you put out there?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. I haven't lived in any property for 10 years myself, so I tend to jump around a bit, although I hate moving, and I've told my wife we're not moving again after our last purchase. But I think it's a really good point. I think there is so much information out there. There's so many information providers out there. In some ways, there can be this analysis paralysis. Which data point is actually really important? Which is telling me the story of the market? That's hard. I mean, in some ways, it's really good that people have this information and they can disseminate it in whatever way they want. Most people looking to buy a property don't really know how to wade through what's important and what's not. I think that's our job, to be clearer on what is really important and tell the story a lot better. And I think that's something that we're definitely looking at trying to do. Is days on site for a property is X at the moment. So what does that mean? What does that mean for someone going to buy a property? What does that mean for someone that's going to sell a property? Just in general, we need to be better at telling that story and helping consumers take that information and make better decisions. In terms of why properties are being held longer, I definitely think that people are generally waiting till later in life to buy their first home. Maybe they are foregoing that opportunity to get into the market earlier, and obviously saving a deposit is extremely hard at the moment, but maybe they realise that, if it's not till the mid-30s that I'm buying a property, let's get something that I don't have to move out of in the next couple of years. In terms of me, I bought my first property when I was 22 years old. It was a serviced apartment with 2 bedrooms. I had a mate that came and lived with me. It was actually a pretty horrible little place, but it was my apartment. It was in Fortitude Valley in Brisbane, so I was happy with the location when I was going out drinking, Thursday, Friday, Saturday night every week. But, looking back, it's like, well, would I have actually been better waiting longer, getting a bigger deposit and getting a better property for the first property? Because when I sold that property, I certainly didn't make much money off it. I think I held it for about 5 years and made about 30 grand paper profit. Obviously, with all the repayments and everything, probably didn't make anywhere near that much profit.
Do you want to save on buyer's agent fees? You could save thousands with Buyers Buyers. As Australia's most extensive network of buyer's agents, we can lock in highly competitive prices. Plus, our national network of buyer's agents are some of the best in the business. So get the Buyers Buyers advantage and talk to us today. Call 1-800-975-051 or visit buyersbuyers.com.au.
I think the decision-making process is different for home buyers and investors. An investor can make a purely financial decision and ideally a very long-term decision. Sometimes life gets in the way, of course. Obviously, for home buyers, though, your job might change, your family situation changes, your requirements change over time. So you may well move around more often. And also, people like to move up the ladder as they get pay rises. But even then, the data can come in useful. I think one of the things we've actually got in common, we spent some time in a townhouse living down on the river in New Farm. And I think I might be right in saying you spent some time in a townhouse, maybe across the other side of the river a few years back. Obviously, as the cities grow over time, we probably expect to see more medium density living. It's already happening in Sydney to some degree, and probably the other cities will follow in time, much like we see in Europe. What do you think about the pros and cons of medium density living? What was your experience of it?
My property wasn't actually a townhouse. It was a ground floor apartment, but it did have a big sort of outdoor area there. But when COVID hit and I had a toddler who was 2.5 years of age, and they just want to get out all the time. And my wife and I are real homebodies. So actually having to go out constantly to entertain our daughter did become a bit of a struggle, and it did drive us to want a bigger backyard. But there are townhouses with bigger outdoor areas than what we had. In terms of the product, I think it's a great product, and I think that there's nowhere near enough townhouse product. If you look at the ABS building approvals data, the number of townhouses built or the share of townhouses approved has pretty much not moved at all in the last 30 years. If you look at even sort of lower and medium density apartment buildings, the share of approvals for them has actually shrunk to almost nothing. I think this is actually a bit of a byproduct of councils making it difficult to deliver this product, but B, also that for a lot of people, they're paying a fortune for these sites, whether it be to amalgamate a few house sites or buy a development site. And the highest and best use for these properties is to go higher. So that's why we sort of miss out on this townhouse property. But, not everyone can afford to buy a house, but there's certain parts of the city that they want to live in. But equally, the people that can't afford to buy a house don't necessarily want to be in an apartment building with hundreds and hundreds of other people. And I think the townhouse product is certainly something that there should be more of and would definitely cater to a need. I think that the challenge is actually just making that stack up in a lot of areas and getting councils on board with developers delivering that product.
As you mentioned there's been a challenge over the last 18 months, 2 years. Some of those properties with shared facilities like pools and gymnasium. Sometimes you've got a shared elevator. And in a lot of cases, people have been keen to get away from that density. Middle of a pandemic, it makes rational sense, I guess. And that's driven this race for space. I think as well, there's far fewer non-resident or foreign buyers around these days, which is making it harder maybe to get some of the pre-sales to actually build some of that medium density product. A follow-on question before we just come on to the outlook for property in 2022 and beyond. Because of the dynamics of the pandemic, we've seen that shift away from the inner cities, and it's not a market I'm active in, but presumably there must be some relatively cheap inner city units around. Do you think for first home buyers there might be some counter-cyclical opportunities there?
There may be some price growth, but it's not going to appreciate at the same pace as, say, a house is going to appreciate. But, potentially maybe somewhere down the track, you move jobs, you get some pay rises, you use that property to go and buy your actual home that you want to live in, and you keep that as an investment property. So I think that's maybe a potential opportunity for first home buyers today. But certainly, prices in a lot of these inner city apartment markets, particularly for 1 and 2 bedroom properties, have come down because there is a real oversupply of that stock, and there isn't a lot of buyers. People looking to buy apartments at the moment are going for more of that owner-occupier style. You even just have to look at what developers are doing now. 4 or 5 years ago, it was all 1 and 2 bedroom apartments in 400 apartment buildings. Now a lot of them are going for sort of 80 or 90 apartments, more niche, more large 2s, large 3s, large 4s, and targeting that owner-occupier demographic. But again, this is all cyclical, right? That will again change at some point in the future. And I think once we start getting overseas students coming back in, we'll start to see a bit of a mending of these inner city apartment markets, at least from a rental perspective. And then obviously if we start to see that rental growth, you will then start to see the investors coming back in and looking to buy those properties again.
Yeah, I mean, Brisbane almost more than anywhere else saw such a huge surge in high density and high rise apartment construction around the CBD, and some of those markets like Newstead. And so I've really went hell for leather on the construction a few years back, but it's kind of balanced itself out now. So let's talk about the property market outlook for the next year or two. And I guess these are the questions that all our listeners want to know the answers to. So it looks to me like we've seen the bottom of the interest rate cycle finally, and we've seen some fixed rate mortgages just creeping a bit higher. A lot of talk about whether the Reserve Bank might even hike the cash rates over the next year or 18 months. So do you think the Aussie market or the housing market will take some momentum into the new year, or do you see things balancing out and cooling off?
There's already signs, I guess, that some of the price growth has started to slow probably over the last 2 or 3 months. We also know that APRA's stepped in and changed the serviceability calculations, increasing them from 2.5% above the offered interest rate to 3%. So that will reduce people's borrowing capacities, and it will knock some potential buyers out of the market. But I think where we're at the moment is that the market's making up for a lot of lost time. So we've been jumping in and out of lockdowns, particularly in Sydney and Melbourne, not so much in some of the other parts of the country, but that's really weighed very heavily on vendors' preparedness to bring properties to the market. So particularly in Sydney and Melbourne, you've had about 3 or 4 months where a lot of vendors have just said, this is too hard, I'm not going to bring anything to the market. At the same time, you've had people that have sold properties and are looking to buy another property. You've had people that have just sort of decided that they want to upgrade their property and buy another one. So you've got this huge amount of pent-up demand from buyers, and we can see that on our platform, the number of searches. We score people based on what they do on our website to know whether or not they're close to making a purchasing decision. And all of those metrics are pretty much at record high levels. But now you're going to see that pent-up supply. So that 4 months that we've seen really low supply, we're going to see a big jump in new listings. And for me, the most interesting things will be how close to equilibrium does demand and supply come over the next few months. But also, we know that there's a lot of buyers out there at the moment. Is the next wave of buyers that come once those people have purchased as large as the one we've just seen? Personally, I don't think it will be, because as you said, fixed rate mortgages have already gone up. And I think that's pretty simple. People will just stop fixing their mortgage and go for the cheaper variable rates. But the rhetoric that we're seeing not necessarily from the Reserve Bank, but in a lot of the papers, is that interest rates are going to go up soon. And I think that will give people pause to think about, actually, do I want to take on that big of a mortgage? maybe do I just do a renovation here and upgrade my own home rather than moving? So I think that coming into 2022, we are going to see slower growth in the market. We are going to see reduced demand. We've also got the federal election coming, and typically we do see people hold off their purchase and selling decisions during a federal election campaign. Now, it doesn't sound like this one's going to be as controversial as the last one. It doesn't seem as if negative gearing and capital gains tax changes are going to be taken to this election. Again, it's just that level of uncertainty for the market. People would prefer to sit on their hands and wait.
Yeah, that makes sense. One of the most confusing things over the past couple of years has been when the immigration taps were switched off, there was this general viewpoint out there that the housing market would be stuffed because you're not having all these new people coming in to buy the properties. Plus, there was the home builder stimulus. So we got all these building approvals, especially for detached homes this time around, all around the country, approvals. And it just seemed as though that surely there's going to be this big overhang of new homes. And yet, for whatever reason, the vacancy rates, yes, they've been high in the CBDs where the students and tourists haven't been around. But actually, in many parts of the country, like where we are in Noosa, there's just nothing for rent. And I guess there's been a shift away from density, and maybe people have got away from their family homes, the youngsters coming into the market. So I guess that's one theory that springs to mind. We've got a strong population pyramid and it's young people moving out. And I guess maybe people are moving out of share homes and so on. What is your take on that? And do you think all of these new approvals and homes are actually going to get built next year? Because I saw construction costs are going through the roof over the last few months, 7% in Q3. So do you think we're going to get all that new supply, and will there actually be an overhang of new homes? And obviously with the immigration settings for next year, we'll have to wait and see.
It's a good question. I mean, the building activity data for June just came out earlier this week. It actually showed that the number of commencements for houses was the highest it's ever been. Now, the fact that it's for houses actually gives me a level of comfort that this stuff's not being built speculatively. I mean, there is some speculative home building going on, but given that we have had home builder, we've seen, there was more than 100,000 people that took up the home builder grant. We've had the lowest interest rates on record. I'm pretty comfortable that a lot of this will actually get built. And a lot of it is people moving out of rentals, people moving out of their parents' homes, and a lot of that first home buyer demand has been brought forward. In terms of what you were talking about in some of the regional markets, I mean, it's a really common problem. And I was talking recently with some people that that manage large rent rolls, and they said one of the things that they have been noticing is that a lot of people that have owned property, whether it be sort of the main examples they used was Southeast Queensland or Western Australia, they haven't seen their investment properties move in price for 10 years, particularly if they're apartments. Now they've got the apartment on the Sunshine Coast or the Gold Coast or, down in Mandurah in Western Australia. They've finally seen some price growth after all this time. A lot of those people are just cashing out. And the people that are buying those properties aren't investors. The people that are buying those properties are not putting those properties back into the rent roll. So you've just got this ongoing tightening of rental supply. I think the other trend that we've seen or that we are seeing that's really hard to actually define is from talking to people, I get the sense that a lot of people are buying what would technically be an investment property but is not actually becoming available for rent. So they have their property in the city and then they have a property in a coastal area pretty close to a capital city, and they're not putting that property up for rent. What they're doing is maybe, if they don't have kids, maybe they're in the city Monday to Wednesday, and then they go to their coastal home Wednesday night and come back to the city on Sunday. Or if they do have kids, Friday night, they take off to the coast and they spend their weekends at that coastal property. So again, technically, I guess that would be seen as an investment property, but the reality is it's a second home. So for people are snapping up these properties, and a lot of them probably used to be rental accommodation. So that's why we're getting this dramatic tightening in rental markets. And notoriously, in a lot of coastal locations, we don't get a lot of new supply. A lot of the councils aren't a lot of times wanting more people and more properties being built in those areas. So that just exacerbates these problems when we see them.
Yeah, it was actually something that Stephen Kukulis mentioned a couple of podcast episodes ago, is that as people become wealthier, and we've become wealthier over the past couple of years, contrary to what we might have expected at the beginning of the pandemic, But as we become wealthier, people just buy more houses. They buy second homes, and the oversupply just hasn't materialised. And that could be one very valid explanation for it. I guess if those properties aren't actually making it to the rental market in the first place, then that would explain why we've seen. When I was looking at some rental figures in some of the inland markets, places like Orange and Wagga and these kind of markets, just nothing for rent. It's just really, really tight.
If you're moving out of Sydney, do you really want, and you're moving to, say, Orange, do you really want to fully commit to going to Orange without maybe going and renting in that market for 6 or 12 months? For a lot of people, they just simply don't have that option anymore. They either have to fully commit and go and buy a house, or they can't find anywhere to rent. So they have to stay in Sydney or stay wherever they are. So I think, for me, if I was going to, say, leave Brisbane and move to Orange, I would probably want to go and try it out for 6 or 12 months before fully committing to it. But I think the pandemic and the big increase in demand, particularly in regional markets, just means that people can't do that now. It's kind of, once you're in, you're all in. And I think it will be interesting over the next few years to see when things start to get back to normal, do we actually see some of these people creeping back to the city? They go, oh, actually, I miss all the stuff that the big city has. Actually, country life's not quite for me. It's too quiet. And I think that will be something that will be very, very interesting to see how that plays out over the next few years.
Yeah, I actually only had 2 more questions and you preempted the first one. And that is really about the immigration settings for next year. I think there's a lot of talk about the immigration cap being lifted to try and alleviate the skills shortage, and there's obviously potential implications for the housing market. But it was a broader question really about demographics and whether we're going to see this working from home phenomenon. I mean, it's clearly going to go on for some time, but are we going to go back towards normal? Will people keep a foot in both camps potentially? So sometime in the city and some regionally. What do you think will happen over the next 2 or 3 years?
I think it's really going to be driven by what businesses do. And I think, unfortunately, humans are kind of creatures of habit. So I know a lot of businesses are now saying you can be completely remote or you can be sort of hybrid, come into the office 1 or 2 days a week. And I think a lot of these regional areas, are sort of doable to live in if you only have to go into the office 1 or 2 days a week. But if we slip back into old habits and it starts to become 3 days a week and then it starts to become 4 days a week, you're expected back in the office, and then it's actually we want you back in the office full time, then I think that the trends will actually start to reverse. I think it's all really going to be led by what businesses do and how much pushback employees do have on those potential changes. But in my mind, there's certain jobs that there is really very little need to go into the office. If you're a computer programmer cutting code, not to generalize too much, but you're probably not the sort of person that's going to be right into all the office culture and everything that does that. You probably you're probably an introvert, enjoy keeping to yourself. And there's no reason why you can't do your job anywhere in the country. But then you've got other functions, marketing, other creative jobs where you need to be able to bounce ideas off each other. And I think doing that over Zoom and not face-to-face is extremely difficult. So it's almost going to be, I think, a set of rules for some people in the business and a different set of rules for other people in the business is what we're going to end up with. And I think that's going to be challenging for the businesses to get their head around that. In terms of the overall market, I think places fairly close to capital cities will continue to be very popular. Southern Highlands in New South Wales, Wollongong. I mean, Wollongong's been popular for years. In Victoria, Bendigo, Ballarat, Geelong, you can commute into the city a few days a week if you need to from those areas. And the Golden Sunshine Coast, Toowoomba, places like that in Queensland. But I think it's areas further afield that have become really popular that we'll start to see a bit of an easing in demand over the next year or two. And, Coffs Harbour's been a market that's been really hot. Now, it's pretty hard to commute anywhere from Coffs Harbour unless you're going to jump on a plane and fly to Sydney. So I think those areas become a little less viable going forward. In terms of your first part of the question about immigration settings, this is going to be one to watch, I think, because Australia has had this really hard border for a long time. Quite honestly, people are going to have made decisions that I'm not going to wait around for Australia to open forever. So whilst I think there will always be people who want to come to Australia, I think we might actually have some challenges attracting the best talent because they've just gone, you know what, it's too hard to get to Australia. I wanted to move 6-9 months ago. I've moved to the US or I've gone to Canada or I've gone to the UK or I've moved somewhere else. For the housing market, though, if there are concerns about an oversupply in the new housing sector, then immigration coming back can possibly fill some of that hole because, of course, when you're not a citizen, in most instances, you have to buy a brand new home. There's obviously a lot of brand new homes being built at the moment. And I think it'll be positive for the developer sector as well because with home builder coming to an end and that pipeline of work that's been created coming to an end, you'll then have more people coming into Australia from overseas. They won't straight away, but over the next 3 to 4 years, they'll start looking to buy their property if they intend to stay here for a long time. And in most instances, unless they're extremely wealthy, they'll have to buy a brand new property.
Yeah, I mean, on these demographic changes, I mean, I could almost be a case study myself because I spend some of the time working in the city, but I also live in Noosa, which is technically a regional market, a couple of hours from the city. But I'm a bit of a hybrid now, and I do some work at home and some in the office when I can get in there. So I think some of these trends might persist. And certainly in Noosa, I've never seen it so busy. So, and I'm sure a lot of those coastal markets like Gold Coast and Central Coast have seen the same. And as you mentioned, the South Coast of New South Wales as well. So my final question, put you on the spot a bit. You're the guy at REA with all the data. And one of the things in property is it's better to take a medium or longer term outlook if you can, because I think we have a tendency to focus on what's happening in the next year or so, or sometimes even shorter periods. But as you mentioned, it's an election year next year. Let's imagine we're having this conversation at the following election, so 2025. What sort of trends or changes do you think we might have seen? Is there anything on the horizon which you expect to see might be just quite different in a few years' time?
I think you kind of touched on it with your comments there about Noosa. Just, people, I think one thing the pandemic has really done is change people's perspective of what's important in life. And I think that leisure time with the family is increasingly important for people. So I do think places like Noosa and the Sunshine Coast and that are going to maintain their popularity because people want to have that balance in their life that we've probably lost over the last 20 or 30 years, being in the office 80 hours a week and things like that. So I think those markets will continue to be strong. In 5 years' time, I think, though, that the biggest difference is going to be what's happening with interest rates. So for the last 30 years, we've seen this ongoing, it does swing a little bit, but essentially we've seen this ongoing decline in interest rates. And with that, we've seen property prices go higher. Property prices have adjusted higher as interest rates have come down. You never say never, but according to the RBA, interest rates can't go any lower than they are currently. And at some point in the future, they are going to have to go up. And I think for me, the interesting thing will be what are the implications for the housing market of that? And I think, whilst I don't think that interest rates are heading back to 10% or 17% or whatever they used to be, higher interest rates are going to mean that going forward, property prices probably don't appreciate at the same pace as they have over the last 30 years. And I think that's something that investors are going to have to face, but also homeowners are going to have to face, because if you're not getting that same growth in the equity in your property, then investing in the property market or upgrading in the property market does become a little bit more difficult. That's why we see, for example, the New South Wales government talking about stamp duty changes. I think what you need to have the market continuing to function is take away some of that friction that is in the market and discourages people from moving. So I'd like to think that sort of 4 or 5 years down the track from here, we have seen some changes around stamp duty. We do make it easier for people to move in and out of the market. The other interesting thing to see will be how build to rent's gone. How's that taken off? Has it actually been as successful as everyone touted it to be? Is it better to have big corporations running rental properties than it is to have mum and dad investors? I'm still not convinced, but obviously 5 years down the track, we'll have a better idea of what that looks like.
Yeah, I've got my own views on that, but maybe I'll save those for another day before I make too many enemies on this episode. So it's been a huge few years for REA Group. And like everyone else, I use realestate.com.au as the biggest listing portal. But particularly, I always follow the REA insights because they go such a long way to improving the consumer journey. And increasingly, it's a digital process these days. People look for properties online. There's a lot of the related services that people seek out online or digitally. So where can people go if they want to follow you, get more from REA Insights? Where should they go?
I'm on Twitter and I'm pretty active on there. So my Twitter handle is @CM Kusher. In terms of the REA product, we're putting out heaps of content all the time. If you just type into Google REA Insights, REA space Insights, you'll come to the REA Insights page. You can click there to get updates whenever anything new is posted. We have a pretty big team nowadays and we're constantly putting out content. And I can tell you within the next 4 to 5 years, hopefully a lot sooner than that, we are going to have a lot more new insight for people and we'll be talking a lot more in depth about what's happening in the housing market. So click on that, sign up and follow us and get all the information you can about what's happening in the property market.
Fantastic. And I'm sure listeners will check all that out. And as you mentioned, also on social media at Twitter, but maybe not when State of Origin is on. So thanks, Cameron. Absolute pleasure to have you on. And it's always a privilege to get your insights from the coalface of property market research data. So thanks for joining this week and we'll see you again next time. Cheers.
Thanks, Pete.
Thanks for listening to Pete's Property Podcast, powered by Buyers. Don't forget to subscribe and join us next time as Pete chats all things property with a new guest. And just a reminder that the information provided in this podcast is general advice only and doesn't take into account your personal financial situation or needs. You should always consult a licensed professional to discuss your individual personal circumstances.